What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Saturday. You know what time it is. Time to get into those wide receiver starts and sits heading into week 4. With it being week 4, this is an important part of the season. This is where we have a good understanding of our roster, the strengths and weaknesses, how we stand compared to our competition. We've seen enough games to know if we need to make a move in order to remain competitive, or if barring injury, we can skate our way into the playoffs. Whichever category you fall into, we're not trying to give up wins here, so making the correct start and sit decisions is always going to be important. In today's video, we'll be going through all the matchups, letting you know overall how we feel about each wide receiver in the matchup, about where in which we have them ranked, so by the end of this video, you'll have a good understanding of which player on your roster we would start over the other. If you do want access to our complete rankings, that's available at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. The link for that, as always, in the description box below. And with that being said, let's hop over to our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was just 2 running backs ranked in the top 10 in PPR scoring formats with single-digit receptions, Nick Chubb being one running back, but which was the other rusher? The correct answer was actually Ezekiel Elliott. Congratulations to Lump Nubs, the first to get this right on YouTube, and as for Twitter, at KJewel. Once again, congratulations to both of you, but as for today's stat of the day, through 3 weeks, which running back has seen the lowest percentage of 8+ defenders in the box? Once again, that's which running back through 3 weeks has seen the lowest percentage of 8+ defenders in the box. If you know who that player is, leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With all of that out of the way, though, we do have a lot of matchups to get into, so without further ado, let's hop right into it. The first matchup we have is the Washington football team on the road against the Atlanta Falcons. Even with both teams having somewhat questionable offenses, the game total is somewhat respectable with 47.5 points. Starting on the Washington side of things, at the receiver position, the only real player we can trust is Terry McLaurin. This is a phenomenal matchup for him, being against the Atlanta Falcons, one of the worst pass defenses you could ask for. And although Terry McLaurin isn't looked at as a bust, he currently stands as the wide receiver 22 in PPR leagues. He scored double-digit fantasy points in every contest, but week 1 and week 3, he posted the exact same stat line, that being 4 receptions for 62 yards in a PPR league. That's 10.2 fantasy points. For a receiver that you're likely relying on as your wide receiver 1 or high-end 2, we would like to see more production out of him than that. In this week against the Atlanta Falcons, that's certainly in the cards. What we're hoping for is that the Atlanta Falcons get it together on offense, with the Washington football team's defense not being as good as we initially expected heading into the season. So Atlanta, a team that's been struggling on offense, a team short of playmakers, they shouldn't have all that much trouble pushing the ball down the field, and that's what we're hoping for. As a Terry McLaurin owner, we're of course hoping for a competitive game. If the Washington football team gets up by 1 or 2 scores, they definitely can rely more on the run game, a la Antonio Gibson. But from what we've seen from this defense over the past few weeks, them getting crushed by Buffalo, even the week before that, Daniel Jones being able to pass successfully against them, I think the odds of Atlanta struggling to pass the ball is unlikely. That means not only is Terry McLaurin a floor play this week, but he also is a ceiling play. For that, it shouldn't be too surprising to hear we have him ranked as a wide receiver 1, a back-end 1, but a premier option at the position to say the least. On the other side of the ball for the Atlanta Falcons, we have Calvin Ridley, who's really been struggling out of the gate. Through 3 weeks, he currently stands as the wide receiver 26 in PPR leagues, and that's not necessarily due to a lack of volume. Week 1, he saw 8 targets. Week 2, he saw 10. Then in week 3, another double-digit target day, coming in with 11. Despite that, though, he's been held to 63 yards or fewer in all contests, only scoring in 1 as well. This not necessarily the production we expected to get out of Calvin Ridley, especially with Julio Jones not being on the roster. He'll look to bounce back in a big way against the Washington football team, and as mentioned earlier, it may sound like a scary defense on paper, but they've been getting absolutely torched by the wide receiver position. Many receivers have already put up their best performances against this defense, so for this one, despite Calvin Ridley having some struggles early on this season, we do have him ranked as a wide receiver 1, a strong wide receiver 1, one that can even compete for top 5 production this week. Outside of him, the only other receiver you would potentially consider starting, that would be Russell Gage, but he's been banged up this season, and while on the field he hasn't been producing. Whether we attribute that to the injury or not, that doesn't change the fact that we're leaving him on the bench this week. Even desperate owners looking to fill their flex should look for other options outside of Gage this week. Even in a positive matchup, he hasn't shown us enough on the field for us to be able to trust him. The next matchup we have is the Houston Texans on the road against the Buffalo Bills. 2 teams on completely opposite ends of the spectrum. It's no wonder why the Buffalo Bills are 17-point favorites at home in this one. Starting with the Texans, being 17-point underdogs is going to promote a pass-heavy game script in theory. Despite that, though, part of the reason why Buffalo is such a heavy favorite is because not only do they have a strong offense, but their defense is great as well, especially at defending opposing wide receivers, specifically outside wide receivers. So Brandon Cooks, a player who's been playing out of his mind the past 3 weeks with 2 different quarterbacks, currently standing as the wide receiver 7 in PPR leagues. This will easily be his greatest test yet. He has proven enough to us so far this season to warrant a start. Even in a bad matchup, you have to throw him in, hope for the best. We do currently have him ranked though as a back-end wide receiver 2, so although he's been posting wide receiver 1 production, our expectations for him in this one are going to be a bit lower, but Brandon Cooks being a player that usually defies everyone's expectations, we can't say we'd be all that surprised to see him overcome this bad matchup. He'll certainly receive enough volume this week. The question is whether or not he can translate that into fantasy points. On the other side of the ball for the Buffalo Bills, they're coming off of a monster performance against the aforementioned Washington football team. In that one, we saw receivers like Cole Beasley and Emmanuel Sanders really step up. Cole Beasley receiving 13 targets. Shockingly enough, the exact same amount of targets he received in week 1 against Pittsburgh. So when it comes to Cole Beasley, clearly he's a much better PPR play. Regardless, in this one, he does warrant a start. All 3 Buffalo receivers at this point do warrant a start, that being Sanders, Cole Beasley, and Stephon Diggs. Even with the team being 17-point favorites, a scenario that usually lends itself to the run game more than the pass game. Regardless, any negative game script concerns are going to be negated by the fact that this pass defense is very poor. We've even seen Trevor Lawrence have a field day against them, so Cole Beasley, coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season, he makes a fine PPR start this week. We actually have him ranked higher than Emmanuel Sanders. Another receiver coming off of his best performances, scoring 2 touchdowns against Washington. So far this season, he's been serving as the primary deep threat, while Stephon Diggs has also been targeted in this area and used for that purpose. Josh Allen and himself have not been connecting as much, so Emmanuel Sanders has really stepped up in his absence. This week, we have Sanders ranked as the wide receiver 40, and Stephon Diggs owners should rejoice in knowing that we do have him ranked as a top 5 wide receiver this week. I know the production we've received out of him hasn't warranted the high draft pick that we invested into him, but better days are certainly ahead. He's had everything we could ask for. He's received the targets, he has the air yards. It's only a matter of time until the targets, the air yards, they do translate into fantasy points. In this week against Houston, I'd say the odds of a bounce back performance, a monster performance out of Diggs, are really good this week. As mentioned, we do have him ranked as a top 5 wide receiver, but moving into the next matchup, we have the Detroit Lions on the road against the Chicago Bears. Chicago this one 3-point home favorites in a game that has a very low total, coming in with 42 points. This one we don't need to spend all that much time in. There's not really any wide receivers that we're considering starting on the Detroit side of the ball. Raymond, Cephas, while both receivers have stepped up at certain points of the season, neither has been playing consistently enough for us to trust in our lineup. So despite this being a top matchup, Chicago currently allowing the 26 most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. That's still not going to be enough motivation for us to start either of those receivers. So outside of TJ Hawkinson on the Detroit side, you're best to look for other options this week. As for Chicago, we have 2 wide receivers potentially in consideration to start. That's of course Allen Robinson and Darnell Mooney. As we all know, with Justin Fields starting, we really haven't seen all that much production through the air. The volume, it's not there. In week 2, Justin Fields attempted 13 passes, followed that up in week 3 with 20 pass attempts, completing 6 in each contest. And I'll tell you what, 6 completions in the entire game isn't enough to support fantasy production for multiple receivers, let alone one. So both Allen Robinson and Darnell Mooney would make very risky starts. Darnell Mooney, we wouldn't even consider starting him in the flex for that reason, but Allen Robinson, he's the lone player that I would consider starting this week. Just know that his floor being extremely low. If you're worried about a player putting up a dud, then you should likely look for other options. Moving into the next matchup, we have a very interesting one with the Carolina Panthers versus the Dallas Cowboys. Dallas in this one being 4.5-point home favorites. Starting on the Carolina side of the ball, there's actually 3 wide receivers that we would consider starting in this one. The reason we're considering 3 wide receivers is because the Dallas Cowboys defense, it's really poor at defending opposing wide receivers. Currently, they've allowed the 7th most fantasy points to the position. So DJ Moore, the current wide receiver 10 on the season, he'll look to continue his hot streak in another positive matchup. With the Dallas Cowboys having a really strong offense, Carolina being underdogs in this one, he'll have a ton of upside. We have him ranked inside the top 10. And for those same reasons, we have Robbie Anderson as a start this week. The Carolina Panthers will need all of their weapons in order to compete offensively with this team. Robbie Anderson being their primary deep threat. Despite getting off to a poor start, he has a really strong chance to succeed in this matchup. One thing to keep in mind though is that he did bust in a positive matchup against the Houston Texans, so despite him having a ton of upside in this matchup, his floor as usual is going to be low. The final player we have is Terrace Marshall, who typically wouldn't be a start, but with Christian McCaffrey being out and the team having to rely on Chuba Hubbard, you could do worse than rolling the dice on Terrace Marshall. He's an upside play. More often than not though, I do believe he will disappoint owners that start him, which is why we do have him listed as a desperation play. But if you're in a deeper league, maybe you've sustained some injuries, Terrace Marshall could be a player you get off of waivers that you can put in and start this week. On the other side of the ball for the Dallas Cowboys, not too much question on whether we're starting these 2 players, that being Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb. Both players unfortunately coming off of disappointing outings against Philadelphia last week. They'll look to bounce back in this one in a matchup that looks a bit difficult on paper, Carolina being being one of the tougher defenses through 3 weeks. One thing to keep in mind though about this defense though is that the level of competition they face so far this season has been extremely poor. They had the New York Jets in week 1, the New Orleans Saints in week 2. Saints, a team that sounds scary offensively, but this isn't the Saints of years past. And then in week 3, they faced the Houston Texans. So Dallas Cowboys by far are going to be the stiffest competition they faced. So although people may be a bit weary in this matchup, that's not holding us back from ranking CeeDee Lamb as a wide receiver 1, Amari Cooper a mid-grade wide receiver 2. Both players who in this matchup I can say confidently have strong ceilings and floors. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Indianapolis Colts against the Miami Dolphins. This one having a very low total coming in with 42 points, Miami being 2-point home favorites. With Tua still being on the IR, Jacoby Brissett will look to be the starter once again this week, and what we saw from him out of the quarterback position last week, it did leave a bit to be desired, but that's not to say that the fantasy weapons in this offense can't have success. I don't think many of us would have guessed heading into last week that Brissett would attempt 49 passes, but even looking back at the Buffalo matchup in week 2, he attempted 40 passes, so the volume is going to be there. Unfortunately though, translating that volume into fantasy points really hasn't been going all that well for Jacoby Brissett. His 49 pass attempts in week 3 translated to 215 passing yards, no touchdowns. His 40 attempts in week 2, 169 passing yards. He did throw a touchdown in that one, but like I mentioned, it does leave a lot to be desired. Overall though, this is a great matchup. I know the Indianapolis Colts do sound like a scary defense, but when it comes to defending opposing wide receivers, they're one of the weakest ones in the league. So Jacoby Brissett, if he has those same types of volume totals, there's plenty of upside for the receivers in this offense. Jalen Waddle being the strongest option, we have him ranked as a wide receiver 3, but Devontae Parker and Will Fuller are in consideration for flex. Devontae Parker being more of the floor play, but Will Fuller, he's always the type of player that can get behind a defense, so in this type of matchup, we could see a player or two break in his favor. He's not the safest option, so if you're looking to avoid risk, then you should look for other options outside of Will Fuller, but in my opinion, you could also do a lot worse. As for the Colts, in this one, Michael Pittman, Zach Pascal. To keep it simple, Zach Pascal, we're leaving him on the bench. Michael Pittman, we have him ranked as a wide receiver 3. Consider him a high floor option in this otherwise difficult matchup. He's received 12 targets in back-to-back games, a likely similar target total to what we can expect this week, and even though the Miami Dolphins have been mitigating fantasy points to the position, the targets will ensure that he doesn't completely bust for your lineup. Just temper your expectations a little bit. The fantasy output and production we've seen from him over the past 2 weeks, it may not be what we get in this matchup. Moving into the next one, we have an interesting offensive matchup with the Minnesota Vikings against the Cleveland Browns. Cleveland on the road in this one. In Minnesota, coming off of a pretty dominant win against the Seattle Seahawks, will be 2-point home underdogs. The projected total in this one coming in at one of the highest with 51.5 points. Starting on the Cleveland side of things, we have Odell Beckham Jr. In his first game back last week against the Chicago Bears, he had a pretty solid performance. 9 targets, 5 receptions, 77 receiving yards. He definitely looked much better on the field than the stat line would represent. So when it comes to this matchup, he's going to have a ton of upside. The Vikings have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to the position. They've been completely dominated by several receivers so far this season. DK Metcalf, Brandon Cooks, T. Higgins, they all had strong days against Minnesota, so Odell Beckham Jr. being one of the only receivers in this offense, at least one of the few that they can rely on. He's an extremely strong start. We have him ranked as the wide receiver 20 this week. Outside of him though, I really wouldn't try to push it and start any other wide receivers on the Cleveland side of things. I know it is a positive matchup, and as mentioned, Odell Beckham Jr. being one of the few wide receivers they can rely on, that does open the door for upside for other players, but knowing exactly which player will produce is going to be too difficult to trust. Rashard Higgins being the favorite, but he's more of a DFS play than anything. On the other side of the ball for the Minnesota Vikings, this is a pretty difficult defensive draw. Regardless though, the production we've seen out of both Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen are going to warrant an auto start each and every week. Jefferson a wide receiver 1, Thielen a wide receiver 2. Keep in mind though, this is a more difficult matchup, so we do have to lower our expectations a bit. Regardless though, Kirk Cousins is playing out of his mind. Both players playing well and producing when their numbers called as well, so regardless of a difficult matchup, you should still feel good about starting them this week. Moving into the next matchup, we have the New York Giants versus the New Orleans Saints. The Saints in this one being 7-point home favorites. Starting with New York, the big news in this one, of course, is that Sterling Shepard and Darius Slayton have been injured and already ruled out. That is going to open up the door for the other wide receivers in this offense, mainly Kenny Golladay, Evan Engram, and potentially rookie Kadarius Toney. Them being 7-point road underdogs is going to promote a positive passing game script. The New Orleans Saints, though, they're no slouch on defense, much stronger against the run than the pass, though. Even with that, the only wide receiver that we're trusting is Kenny Golladay, and I use trust very lightly. We haven't really seen a strong connection between Daniel Jones and Kenny Golladay so far this season. Kenny Golladay himself, a player that's been on the injury report, a bit banged up, missed some snaps last week. So despite this being his greatest opportunity so far this season, the best we can do is rank him as a back-end wide receiver 3, still within the top 36, but outside the top 30 nonetheless. As for New Orleans, I know Marquez Callaway did have himself a day last week, seeing 5 targets, catching 4 of them, even catching a receiving touchdown. He was one of the top waiver ads for many people heading into this week. First off, I see him as a short-term rental. When Michael Thomas gets back, he's going to be impossible to start. Second, this is a very low-volume passing offense. Even though Jameis Winston is very efficient or has been playing very efficient so far this season, 5 targets isn't going to be on the low end for what we can expect from him. It's probably going to be more towards the median. And with his touchdown last week being a bit fluky, not the play that was drawn up, even though he is coming off of a solid performance, I wouldn't try to chase those fantasy points. So for that, we do have him listed as a sit this week. Too risky, even in my opinion, to be listed as a desperation flex. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Tennessee Titans versus the New York Jets, and this one's very interesting because the Tennessee Titans have sustained injuries to both AJ Brown and Julio Jones. Both players at this point have already been ruled out. That means the most likely leading receiver on this team is going to be a receiver by the name of Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. Last week, you may remember him for catching a touchdown. He saw 4 targets, catching all 4 of them for 58 receiving yards. And so far this season, in the limited action that we've seen from him, he's produced pretty well, catching 6 of his 7 total targets on the year. So if thrust in the position, he does have a solid chance to produce. This is a very beatable matchup against the New York Jets. Please excuse the graphic that does have Julio Jones listed as a wide receiver 3. This was before he got ruled out. But if you did lose out on Julio Jones or AJ Brown and you're looking for a spot start, putting in Nick Westbrook-Ikhine and trusting him as nothing more than a flex, it could definitely pay dividends for you this week because they simply just don't have other options to throw to. On the other side of the ball for the New York Jets, this is a really good spot for them. They are going to be playing at home. They're 6.5 point underdogs. The game total, 45 points. While typically in other matchups, the time of possession is completely lopsided. I think in this one, with the Tennessee Titans having a weak passing defense, a weak defense altogether, the New York Jets may find themselves having an easier time sustaining drives. And with Tennessee having question marks offensively, time of possession may not be completely lopsided like it typically is in a New York Jets game. So unlike other matchups, I do think they come into this one with a bit more upside. The player, of course, that we love the most, the only one that realistically we can trust, is Corey Davis. We have him ranked as a solid wide receiver 3 candidate, consider him a high floor option. Outside of him though, the next leading receiver would be Braxton Berrios, but even in a positive matchup, that's too much of a stretch. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Philadelphia Eagles. I'm really excited to watch this matchup. It should be one of the more exciting ones on the week. It has one of the highest totals, coming in with 54 points. Philadelphia 6.5 point home underdogs. But starting with Kansas City, I know Tyreek Hill has been a bit underwhelming lately. A player who over his last 2 contests has seen a combined 11 targets, being held to 56 yards last week and only 14 yards the week before. We should look for him to bounce back in this game. I know the Philadelphia Eagles do sound like a positive matchup on paper, but so far this season, they've been pretty good at limiting production to fantasy receivers. Think Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb, 2 players that disappointed last week. I know that was divisional, but it's not unlike how the Philadelphia Eagles have been performing all season long. Regardless though, there's still a defense that is susceptible to big plays, and Tyreek Hill being a player who can score from any area of the field. Look for him to get behind this defense. It only takes one play for him, and I'm sure it comes to no surprise we have him ranked as a strong wide receiver 1 this week. On the other side of the ball for the Philadelphia Eagles, we have Devonta Smith and possibly Jalen Reagor. Devonta Smith is going to get the higher ranking, being projected as a wide receiver 3 in this matchup, but keep in mind he is coming off of 2 very disappointing performances, being held to 2 receptions for 16 yards in week 2, 3 receptions for 28 yards in week 3 in what was a positive matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. Now he's getting a more difficult draw in the Kansas City Chiefs, but due to the fact that the Philadelphia Eagles are going to need to have production from the wide receivers in order to remain competitive, once again one of the highest totals on the week, he's going to come into this one with plenty of upside. We could expect a performance similar to what we saw in week 1, 6 receptions, 71 yards, and a receiving touchdown. As for Reagor though, the reason we bring him up is because quietly he's been the more productive receiver of the 2, coming off of his highest target performance, coming in with 8 targets, catching 5 of them for 53 yards. He's now seen 19 targets through 3 games, produced double-digit fantasy points in 2 of his 3 games as well, and the only one he really didn't produce and put up starter level production was in a difficult defensive matchup against the San Francisco 49ers. If you're somebody thin at the position or in a deeper league, you could do worse than Jalen Reagor this week, a player who overall is unlikely to bust. Moving into the next one, which is another exciting matchup, we have the Arizona Cardinals against the LA Rams. This is a game with two explosive offenses with plenty of weapons in the receiving game. It's no wonder why it has one of the highest totals of the week, coming in just under 55 points. The LA Rams in this one, 4-point home favorites. A positive passing game script for the Arizona Cardinals, who have 4 potential weapons you could start this week. DeAndre Hopkins, of course, being the highest ranked receiver, coming off of a disappointing performance, banged up himself. Unfortunately, the tough news for DeAndre Hopkins owners is that if you own him, you gotta start him. Our expectations, though, definitely do have to be adjusted because last week, playing injured, he really didn't perform well, and it was a very beatable matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. This one, much more difficult, one that even when healthy, DeAndre Hopkins could disappoint from a fantasy perspective. So we do have him ranked as a wide receiver too, because he always is going to have that upside. He is DeAndre Hopkins, of course, but as mentioned, we do have to be aware that a disappointing outing is well within his range of outcomes. The next two wide receivers for Arizona, Rondale Moore, Christian Kirk. In my opinion, you could flip a coin based on which player is going to have the better fantasy day this upcoming week. Christian Kirk did edge out Rondale Moore, who busted last week in a positive matchup against Jacksonville. So if you're looking for floor, maybe you do avoid Rondale Moore. But both Kirk and Rondale Moore are players that I do like to put in my flex because we know what type of upside they bring to the table. Both players also being threats to score from any area of the field, and while unlikely against this passing defense, it's a factor I do like to have in players I put in my flex. And the fourth wide receiver that we could potentially start this week is AJ Green, who has been somewhat productive over the past few weeks. He's seen exactly 6 targets in all 3 contests, catching a receiving touchdown in week 2 against Minnesota, following that up in week 3, putting up over 100 receiving yards. So at this point, a game that has a very high total. You could do worse than starting AJ Green, and while he's not a threat to score from any area of the field, it's a positive sign to see his target market share in this offense remain consistent. That's not something we can say about both Christian Kirk and Rondale Moore, and while we do have him ranked the lowest of all 3 of those receivers, he still makes a fine play in the flex this week. On the other side of the ball, we have Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. No question when it comes to Cooper Kupp, he's the #1 fantasy receiver. He'll look to continue his absolutely hot streak this week. Arizona has been giving it up to the wide receiver position, so he does have a good chance to continue that streak as well. As for Robert Woods, he's the player that has the most question marks, and I know a lot of you out there are probably wondering if you should bench him, and I can't say I blame you. Currently in PPR leagues, he's the wide receiver 47. Despite catching a touchdown in week 1, he's seen a reduction in fantasy output in each contest since, ultimately leading to his worst fantasy performance, which was last week in week 3. So those of you out there that have questions on whether you should start him or not, I can understand wanting to bench him. Me personally, though, I wouldn't. We have him ranked as a wide receiver 2. As mentioned, the Arizona Cardinals rank in the top 10 at allowing fantasy points to the wide receiver position, so it is a positive matchup. On top of that, they're one of the better offenses in the league, so if there's any team in the league that can push the LA Rams offensively, Arizona would be the team. So Robert Woods, even though he's been a disappointment for fantasy so far, I'm willing to give him one more week. The next matchup we have is the Seattle Seahawks versus the San Francisco 49ers. I was surprised to see this one having such a high total, coming in with 52 points. San Francisco being 3-point home favorites in this one. And starting with Seattle, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. Metcalf in week 1 and week 2 playing second fiddle to Tyler Lockett from a fantasy perspective. That got flipped last week, Tyler Lockett injuring himself. At the time, it did look to be a severe injury, but as it stands, we are expecting him to play, which is a positive sign for both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett because this defense isn't going to be easy to break. Having both receivers is going to open up opportunities for each one. Metcalf will benefit from having Lockett on the field as Lockett benefits from Metcalf, but I will say with Tyler Lockett being banged up or presumably banged up after seeing him sustain that injury, you have to side with Metcalf when it comes to which wide receiver you would choose over the other. Most of us don't have to choose and you only own one, in which case both are starts. Metcalf being a wide receiver 1 in this contest, Tyler Lockett being a wide receiver 2. Keep in mind the floor for Lockett could be a bit low. Any player coming into the week with an injury, that is always going to amplify their risk. If it's still something that's nagging him or something he's dealing with, there's always the chance that it re-aggravates and potentially pulls him out of the contest early. On the other side of the ball for the San Francisco 49ers, this is a phenomenal matchup for both Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. Deebo Samuel, a player who's been producing all season long, starting off as a wide receiver 1. On the season, he still ranks as the wide receiver 11, but unfortunately, we've seen him trending down in each contest since his week 1 performance, a game in which he posted over 30 fantasy points. Fast forward to week 2 in PPR leagues, he put up 16. Week 3 against Green Bay, he put up 10. It is promising, though, to see him have 12 targets in week 1, followed that up with 8 targets, and then now in week 3, 10 targets. So there's no question on whether or not he's involved in this offense. He is clearly one of the top receivers, if not the top receiver. So in this great matchup against Seattle, he'll have plenty of upside. I'd be completely shocked if he continued to trend down when it comes to fantasy output. Start him as a wide receiver 2 with confidence, and outside of him, we do have Brandon Ayuk, who did actually get involved in the offense. He was massively out-targeted by Debo, but he still saw 6 himself, catching 4 of them, producing 37 receiving yards, even scoring a touchdown. One of the targets that he didn't catch was also in the end zone, so it was a potential 2-touchdown day for him. So Ayuk is getting very valuable targets. Like I said about Debo, this is a great matchup. You can start Ayuk with confidence. He is a high upside guy, a ceiling guy, so the perfect player to put in your flex this week. The next matchup we have is the Baltimore Ravens against the Denver Broncos. This one having a very modest total, coming in with 44.5 points. Denver being 1-point home underdog. Starting off with the Baltimore side of things, unfortunately, this is a very difficult defensive draw. Denver Broncos have been one of the better defenses on the season. Baltimore Ravens in their offense themselves, it hasn't looked all that great. Definitely they have some holes. Last week against a much worse Detroit Lions defense, we did see them struggle at times. So Marquise Brown, a player who dropped 2 touchdowns last week, he is still going to be ranked as a wide receiver 3 and will always have that upside, but the odds of him breaking away and potentially having one of those long touchdowns, it's going to be much less likely against this strong defense. And it should go without saying, but there's no other receiver for the Baltimore Ravens that we're trusting in this contest. On the other side of the ball, we have Courtland Sutton and Tim Patrick. Courtland Sutton coming off of a disappointing performance himself. I know many people are going to be afraid to attack this matchup against the Baltimore Ravens because it's Baltimore, but so far this season, they haven't been producing all that well, especially against the wide receiver position. Yes, they did hold Tyreek Hill in check, but they did have to sell out in order to make that happen. No receiver on the Denver Broncos is going to force them into that situation, so the odds of Courtland Sutton being shut out is just unlikely. So start him as a wide receiver 3, but one that has a decent amount of upside. The floor for him in this one should be pretty good, and I would also say the floor for Tim Patrick in this one should also be good. The team being without both Jerry Jeudy and now KJ Hamler reaching IR. Tim Patrick, though, a lower upside player, somebody I would trust in the flex. His ceiling overall being a bit lower, but still somebody you can trust not to put up a dud. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Pittsburgh Steelers on the road against the Green Bay Packers. This one has a modest total of 45.5 points. Green Bay 6.5 point home favorites. For Green Bay, we're trusting Devontae Adams to start, nobody else. Deontay Johnson is slated to return this week. Whether or not he's going to play on a full amount of snaps, that is a bit up in the air. For that, we do have him a bit lower in the rankings. He is coming in just outside the top 40, ranked even behind Chase Claypool, the receiver who led the team in targets last week, coming in with a whopping 15 targets. If Deontay loses snaps, Chase Claypool seems to be the highest targeted receiver behind him, that meaning Juju Smith-Schuster, the third fiddle, also a player banged up himself. We do have him ranked very similarly to Deontay, coming in as the wide receiver 45, so both him and Deontay players that we wouldn't trust as more than a flex. As for Chase Claypool, we do have him ranked as a wide receiver 3, but with how poor the Pittsburgh Steelers have been playing offensively, it's difficult to trust any one of the 3. Moving into the Sunday night game, one of the most exciting matchups of the entire week, maybe not for fantasy, but there certainly are going to be fantasy relevant players in this one. Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the New England Patriots. Patriots are playing at home. The total for this one, 49.5 points. That is on the higher end for a New England Patriots game, although they are 7-point underdogs. Starting with Tampa Bay, I love the upside for all 3 receivers, even though this is an otherwise poor matchup. I think there is a motivation factor when it comes to Tom Brady. Even though he is the quarterback 2 on the season, I wouldn't be surprised for him to put up his best fantasy output of the season. A narrative could be split the other way. Bill Belichick knowing him the best, that could work against Tom Brady. But what I've learned over the years is betting against Brady is never something you want to do, so I'm taking shares of Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and even Antonio Brown, who was returning from the COVID list. And when it comes to ranking these 3 players, we have Chris Godwin in the front. He's going to be ranked just outside the top 15. Mike Evans, also a wide receiver 2, being ranked just outside the top 20. And when it comes to Antonio Brown, he's a wide receiver 3 in this one with plenty of upside. On the other side of the ball, Jacoby Myers is definitely the guy. While he remains scoreless on the season and Even dating back to 2020, he's seeing a massive amount of targets. He saw 14 targets last week, a similar target total to what he was experiencing in 2020 for a short time. So this does make him a better option in PPR leagues, but considering this is against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a team that has allowed the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, Jacoby Myers can be trusted in all formats as a top 30 option. The final game we have is the LA Chargers versus the Las Vegas Raiders. This is the Monday night game. Two very high-powered offenses that have been producing very well lately. Two teams trending upward. Raiders even being undefeated at this point, and the LA Chargers coming off of a win against the Kansas City Chiefs. So while in preseason we may have scoffed at this one, looking at the schedule, this one is going to be an extremely interesting matchup. The projected total being 52 points means plenty of weapons are going to be usable, plenty of fantasy points to go around, and starting with the Las Vegas Raiders, there are three wide receivers you could potentially consider, being Bryan Edwards, Hunter Renfrow, and Henry Ruggs. The receiver I would put my money on out of the three would definitely be Ruggs. He's now seen 7 targets in back-to-back contests, and what we know about Ruggs is he doesn't need a high amount of targets in order to produce. 7 targets in week 2, a mere 5 receptions. We're talking 113 yards and a touchdown. 4 receptions the following week in week 3 against what is a more difficult matchup in the Miami Dolphins. 4 receptions for him turned into 78 receiving yards. So far on the season, he's averaged over 20 yards per reception. So even in what's another difficult matchup, Henry Ruggs can certainly overcome it. We do have him ranked as the highest receiver on the Las Vegas team, coming in just outside the top 40, so a better player to put in the flex. And as for Hunter Renfrow and Bryan Edwards, you can also start them in the flex. Hunter Renfrow being more of the high floor option. He scored double-digit fantasy points in each contest, actually scoring his most fantasy points on the season last week against Miami. His catch rate, very strong. He's reliable. And with this being a very important matchup for both teams, Hunter Renfrow being a reliable option means the team is likely to rely on him. As for Bryan Edwards, he's seen a max of 5 targets in any given game. Similarly to Ruggs though, he's a high yards per catch guy. Translating his 5 targets in week 1, he turned them into 4 receptions for 81 yards, 5 targets in week 3, 3 receptions for 89, so he doesn't need a ton of volume in order to produce, but with him being 3rd in the pecking order for targets, he is going to be one of the more riskier starts. And then finally, we have the LA Chargers. When it comes to Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, we have now moved Mike Williams ahead of Keenan Allen in the rankings. Simply put, the connection we've seen from Williams and Herbert has just been phenomenal. At this point, as long as Mike Williams stays healthy, I wouldn't be surprised if he finishes the season as a wide receiver 1, and if he continues to produce like he is, being ranked ahead of Keenan Allen will be a weekly occurrence. If you own either of these two receivers, you're starting them, and we have them both ranked as a wide receiver 1, both back-to-back in the rankings, coming in as the wide receiver 10 and 11. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.